Today we're going to be covering one of the most important questions in gaming history. It's certainly the question that keeps me up at night, the one that causes me to wake up in a cold sweat from horrific nightmares in which I'm being chased by oddly formed yellow-haired potato men screaming, "Bayazura, Bayazura, Bayazura!" And that question is, why are Oblivion NPCs so inexplicably ugly? Don't get me wrong, I love Oblivion, it's an incredible game. But even the most die-hard fans cannot deny one simple fact, and that is that the NPCs are as ugly as sin. They look like they were modelled in plasticine and then stampeded by an army of toddlers wearing wooden clogs. And it's not just a handful of examples either. Look at this guy, and this guy, and this guy. That's a face that even a mother would struggle to love. My question is, why? These potato-esque humanoids are so out of kilter with the rest of the game's visuals. The landscape is stunning for the graphical capabilities of the time, the architecture looks great, the enemy creatures look fine as well for the most part. Nothing else in the game is so comically ugly as the NPCs. There must be a reason for this. Bethesda are definitely not short on artistic talent. And they don't have some unexplained weakness when it comes to designing NPCs. They are 100% capable of making, at the very least, normal looking NPCs. So how did the Mr. Potato Head theme ever see the light of day? Well, I think it was the perfect storm of 5 different factors that came together to produce this unfortunate, yet wonderful result. The first and most obvious one is the fact that the graphics are now very out of date. Oblivion was released in 2006 and clearly graphical capability has increased exponentially since that time. The textures, lower polygon count and lack of finer detail, which we'll cover more at point 3, definitely contribute to the NPC's unattractive appearance when compared to more modern standards. But let's not forget that they felt ugly even back then, and many players pointed this out at the time, including myself. Other games released during and before 2006 that didn't feature these oddly misshapen characters, and this weirdly wonderful butter-faced look was certainly not universal in 2006 games. The NPCs of games like Final Fantasy XII, for example, that also released in 2006, looked basic by today's standards, sure, but they didn't look like the love child of Mr. Incredible and a boiled potato. So the graphical capabilities of the time are certainly not the main cause, at least in my opinion. But I mention them first as they do accentuate several of the following factors, and they contribute to making some of the wacky features of Oblivion NPCs more pronounced. One such feature that probably wasn't helped by the graphical capabilities of 2006, or at least those of the creation engine at the time, is the slightly confused art style of Oblivion's NPCs. I can only assume that the art direction that Bethesda took with these NPCs didn't quite work out how the designers intended. I mean, something definitely went wrong, didn't it? Now, in my opinion, this is because they wanted to go for something more stylized after the more bland-looking NPCs of Morrowind. They wanted the world to be alive with vibrant, standout characters. Well, they certainly stood out, so mission accomplished in that regard, I guess. Unfortunately, the technology deployed just didn't quite turn that vision into a reality, and the NPCs just ended up with these massively exaggerated features that gave many of them what felt like an unintended comical twist. Facial proportions in particular fell foul of this, and we ended up with a look that I can only describe as the result of multiple generations of inbreeding in Cyrodiil. I think the key area where this more ambitious art style and the tech didn't quite marry up is around lighting and shading. Now, obviously I'm no expert on it, so it would be really interested to hear from those who are in the comments down below, but it felt to me like these particular limitations in lighting and shading technology, at least with the engine deployed, resulted in poor shadowing and flat textures on NPC faces, which I think is what underpins the potato look that was so prevalent in the Oblivion NPCs. If you really worked on a character, then you could produce something passable. But you really had to play the system just right to not inadvertently include one of these awkward flat surfaces that would throw out the proportions of your character's face. And of course you'd then not realise it until you looked at your character from a certain angle in game. And by that point, it's too late. You either embrace the butterface, or you go back to character creation. This probably wouldn't have been quite as much of an issue if the character creation system was a little less liberal with what it allowed you to do. What I'm talking about here is the extremes that the system allowed when adjusting the various facial proportions of a character. Remember, it's not just players using this system to design their character, it's also how Bethesda would create NPCs. Now, to be fair, I think Bethesda were actually a little ahead of their time with what they were trying to achieve with this system. The character customization options offered in Oblivion were vast for a 2006 game, but perhaps a little too vast. If the sliders were just a little more constrained in terms of the extremes you could go to with facial proportions, then this may have mitigated some of the oddness. Of course, the downside would be that we would then miss out on some glorious creations, such as this one. But hopefully you can see what I mean about these factors starting to play into each other at this point. When you take the limited graphical capabilities of the time, in particular the lighting and shading constraints, throw in a confused art style, and then roll it all up into a character customization system that lets you do too much, then you can start to see why the output is a little interesting, let's say. Finally, the icing on the cake is that the developers then let go of control of this system for some of the NPCs in the game, opting for them to be randomly generated. Now, this makes total sense given that you can kill certain NPCs in game, and they then need to be replaced so that you don't end up with a totally empty world. And of course, you can't go with custom designs for every dynamically created NPC, as you don't even know how many you're eventually going to need. Now, clearly certain constraints were set when NPCs were randomly generated, as you didn't end up with some of the absolute monstrosities that players have created over the years using the character creation system. But clearly the randomization still resulted in some very strange looking NPCs spawning into the game. This explains why the carefully designed NPCs like Martin Septim, for example, look absolutely fine. But then some of the random NPCs you encounter look creepy as shit. Then of course you have the facial expressions, which really sealed the deal. Basically because the application of uniform expressions to extremely variable randomly generated faces make them look, well, quite frankly, deranged. Overall, when you combine all of these 5 factors, you get something unique, something special, something beautiful in its own way. After all, we have to acknowledge that these NPCs haven't just faded into obscurity like most. Their legacy is forever secured. They will live on in the great hall of memes for all eternity. Anyway, if you enjoyed this absolute nonsense, remember to like the video and subscribe to my channel for more RPG related content. And I'll see you in the next one.